It was almost a year ago, but the memory of that Christmas party still lingers in my mind. The event was held at Charlotte's office, a sleek high-rise downtown that always felt like another world compared to the quiet life we built together at home. I remember the way the place was transformed that night, the normally sterile conference rooms decked out with garlands, twinkling fairy lights, and tables overflowing with catered food. A jazz quartet played softly in the background, their melodies weaving through the hum of conversation and clinking glasses. Charlotte was in her element. She looked stunning in a dark green dress, her hair cascading in soft waves over her shoulders. As the marketing director for one of the city's most successful firms, she commanded attention, not just for her looks, but for her poise and confidence. Watching her that night, I couldn't help but feel proud. 7 years together, 6 of those as husband and wife, and I still couldn't believe she was mine. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but I thought it was solid. Sure, we had our arguments like anyone else. And yes, her career kept her busy, sometimes too busy, but we'd always made it work. I told myself that love, trust, and a little patience could weather anything. At least, I used to believe that. That night, though, something shifted. Steve. That was the name that stuck with me. He was her boss, and Charlotte had mentioned him often over the past year. Too often, if I'm being honest. Steve had this brilliant idea, or Steve loved my presentation. At first, I chalked it up to her admiration for someone successful in her field. But the frequency of his name in our conversations had started to gnaw at me, a quiet unease I couldn't quite shake. I met him for the first time at the party. He was everything I expected, tall, polished, and effortlessly charismatic. He greeted me warmly, shaking my hand firmly as Charlotte stood beside him, her laugh just a touch louder than usual. I watched the way they interacted, how his gaze lingered on her just a little too long, how her smile seemed brighter when she spoke to him. I told myself I was imagining things. Paranoia, I thought. Still, I couldn't ignore the way my stomach tightened when I saw them together. The party went on, and I tried to relax, nursing a glass of whiskey as I mingled with her colleagues. But I couldn't help but glance toward Charlotte every so often. She was always in the thick of things, laughing, talking, commanding attention. She looked happy, genuinely happy, and yet I felt like an outsider in her world. The irony stung. Charlotte had begged me to come to this event, insisting it was important for her career. "It's mandatory," she'd said weeks ago with her disarming smile. "Steve wants all the senior partners and their spouses there. You'll charm everyone like you always do, I promise." Back then, her excitement was contagious. Tonight, though, it felt like I was a prop in a play where everyone else knew their lines except me. I sipped my watered-down whiskey and scanned the room, the laughter and clinking glasses barely registering. It was a far cry from the quieter evenings Charlotte and I used to spend dreaming about the future. We had planned to start trying for a baby next year. She wanted to wait, citing her career's meteoric rise as a reason to hold off. I'd agreed, though her hesitation had stung. Lately, it seemed her job was her real love. Her world revolved around Steve, her boss, and her increasingly frequent late nights. The sound of laughter pulled me back to the present. I was talking to one of Charlotte's colleagues, a junior associate who was all too eager to make small talk. I noticed his eyes dart to something, or someone, behind me. When I turned, Charlotte was the focal point of a group, laughing effortlessly at something Steve had said. Her hand rested lightly on his arm as he leaned in to whisper something. "Your wife's quite the star here," the junior associate remarked. There was sympathy in his tone that I didn't understand until I caught the sidelong glances from others in the room. A few smiled at me politely, but the expressions of others held something closer to pity. It wasn't long before I realized I hadn't seen Charlotte for a while. My eyes instinctively sought her out, scanning the clusters of partygoers, but she was nowhere to be found. The last place I'd seen her was near the bar, with Steve. I wandered over to the spot, my chest tightening. She wasn't there. Steve wasn't either. I approached one of her coworkers, someone I vaguely recognized from a dinner months ago. "Have you seen Charlotte?" Her coworker hesitated, then glanced towards the staircase. She went upstairs a while ago. I think Steve went up too. He's got an office on the next floor. A chill ran through me as I processed the words. Upstairs. Together. I thanked the coworker and forced myself to stay composed as I made my way to the stairs. My mind raced, grasping for innocent explanations, but my gut churned with unease. Whatever I was about to find at the top of those stairs, I knew one thing for certain. My life was about to change. The hallway stretched before me like a gauntlet, dimly lit and eerily quiet compared to the lively din of the party below. My steps faltered as I passed door after door, each one looking identical. Anxiety clawed at me, my chest tightening with every wrong turn. Where is it? Steve's office. But where? Finally, a faint sound reached my ears, a muffled thump, followed by what could only be described as laughter mixed with something else. My stomach twisted. I followed the noise, each step pulling me closer to a door at the end of the hallway. As I approached, the sounds grew clearer, a mix of gasps and murmurs barely contained by the wood between us. The voices were unmistakable, Charlotte's melodic laughter, tinged with something far more intimate and a deeper, rougher tone that had to belong to Steve. I stopped just short of the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. My hand trembled as I pulled out my phone and activated the camera. If I was wrong, I'd apologize later. But if I was right, I didn't want to think about it. I needed proof, evidence, something to hold on to in the wreckage of whatever was on the other side. Heart racing, I tried the doorknob. Locked. My breath came in short bursts, the frustration and dread rising in equal measure. A sane man might have walked away, but I wasn't sane. Not anymore. The door opened inward. I could tell by the position of the hinges. Without giving myself a chance to second guess, I braced myself, shifted my weight, and drove my shoulder into the door. The impact jolted through me, but the lock was cheap, no match for the momentum of my desperation. The door flew open, slamming against the wall, revealing the scene inside. Charlotte and Steve froze, like deer caught in the headlights of a very angry truck. They were a mess of tangled limbs and misplaced clothing, a tableau of guilt so absurd it would have been comical if it hadn't been my life. Charlotte's blouse hung half off her shoulder like it had been attacked by a confused octopus, while Steve's tie was wrapped around his head like a crown, his shirt undone in a way that seemed more chaotic than seductive. The desk behind them was an avalanche of papers and overturned coffee cups, bearing witness to their lack of professionalism in more ways than one. For a moment, none of us moved. Charlotte's eyes widened in pure horror, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Steve, pale as a ghost, made a weak attempt to pull himself together, failing miserably as his pants betrayed him, sagging like a poorly anchored tent. I can explain, Charlotte stammered, clutching at her blouse in a futile attempt at decency. Steve, meanwhile, raised a hand as though I was a waiter and he was about to order a latte. Look, man, this isn't what it... I cut him off with a laugh that surprised even me. It was a hollow, bitter sound that echoed in the room. Oh, please, I said, holding up my phone, the camera still rolling. By all means, explain. Their expressions shifted, panic, shame, and indignation all warring for dominance. Before you find out what happens next, please subscribe to the channel. My eyes darted between them, my breathing shallow as the weight of the scene pressed down on me. I lowered my phone and slid it into my pocket, the camera still recording. The proof I'd captured was more than enough. Charlotte and Steve had been caught red-handed, and there was no talking their way out of it. But even as the phone disappeared from view, the simmering rage in my chest demanded more than quiet documentation. My voice came out low, trembling with barely restrained anger. So this is what I've been dragged here for? A front row seat to my own humiliation? Matthew, please, you don't understand. Charlotte started, her tone desperate and shaky. Oh, I understand perfectly, I snapped, my voice rising. I understand that the woman I've spent the last 8 years of my life with, the woman I've loved, trusted, and planned a future with, has been sneaking around with her boss. And for what? Was this some kind of sick game? Did you invite me here to publicly humiliate me, or was that just a bonus? Charlotte's lips moved, but no words came out. Her face twisted into an expression I'd never seen before, equal parts shame and panic. She finally stammered, It's not what it looks like." I let out a humorless laugh that echoed in the room. "Not what it looks like? Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife decided to turn her boss's office into a soap opera set." "Look," Steve interjected, straightening his disheveled shirt in a transparent attempt to regain some authority. "This is clearly a misunderstanding. If you two had a happy marriage, none of this would have happened." My head snapped toward Steve, my glare sharp enough to cut steel. "A misunderstanding? That's your excuse? Blame the marriage? Blame me?" Steve shrugged, his voice laced with infuriating smugness. "I'm just saying, maybe this wouldn't have happened if you'd been paying more attention to your wife's needs. People don't stray for no reason." His words were gasoline on the fire burning inside me. I crossed the room in 2 swift strides and grabbed Steve by the scruff of his shirt, slamming him against the wall with a force that rattled the framed certificates hanging beside us. Papers fluttered to the ground as I pressed closer, my knuckles whitening as I tightened my grip. "You think you're going to lecture me about marriage? You snake!" I snarled, my voice vibrating with fury. "You don't get to wreck my life and then pretend this is my fault." "Calm down," Steve choked out, his hands feebly tugging at my iron grip. "If you don't let go, I'll call security. File a report with the police. Assault charges. You hear me?" I froze for a moment, my nostrils flaring as I considered the consequences. Slowly, I released him, but not gently. He stumbled against the wall, straightening his rumpled clothes with shaking hands. "This isn't over," I said coldly, my voice as sharp as glass. Steve took a cautious step back, wary of any sudden movement. "It should be. Walk away while you can." I ignored him, turning to Charlotte instead. "How long?" I demanded, my voice cracking under the weight of the question. Charlotte's eyes widened. "Matthew, how long has this been going on?" I repeated, my tone steadier now but no less lethal. She hesitated, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't decide on a lie that would sound convincing. Her silence stretched, filling the room like a toxic gas. "That long," I said finally, my voice hollow. "You can't even say it out loud, can you?" Charlotte looked down at her feet, unable to meet my eyes. The confirmation I needed, and dreaded, was in her silence. It hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever love and trust we'd built had been burned to ash, and she wasn't even brave enough to face it. I stepped back, my face hardening into a mask of resolve. "You two deserve each other," I spat, my voice laced with disgust. "Enjoy your victory, Steve. It's as hollow as the person you've chosen to share it with." I turned toward the door, ready to leave them to wallow in their guilt and shame. But as I reached the doorway, something inside me snapped. The words I'd been holding back surged to the surface. I turned back, the fury in my chest boiling over. "Now I understand why you didn't want a child, Charlotte. God forbid you upset your boss. Or maybe—" I gestured around the wrecked office, my tone drenched in sarcasm. "Your rapid rise in the company has more to do with private meetings like this than any actual talent." Charlotte broke down, her sobs muffled by her hands as she slumped against the desk. A sound that once would have torn me apart now left me numb. I barely noticed her as Steve stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Get out of here," he barked. "Enough of these family squabbles. And by the way, you broke the door to my office. Do you have any idea how much that's going to cost?" I turned to him slowly, every ounce of my contempt etched into my expression. I stepped closer, staring him down. "Shut your mouth, you idiot," I hissed, my voice low but venomous. "You're just a sleaze who thinks with what's in his pants. A disgrace to your position, but I guess it fits someone like you." He clenched his jaw, clearly seething, but I didn't wait for a response. He wasn't worth my time. I turned back toward the hallway, my steps steady, my mind made up. As I reached the doorway, I spoke without turning back. "I will never forgive betrayal," I said, my voice calm and final. "Expect the divorce papers after the holidays." "Matthew!" Charlotte's voice cracked as she cried out, her words trembling with desperation. "Matthew, please, give me a second chance. We can talk about this later. This isn't over yet." I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. Her voice echoed after me, but it sounded small and distant. She had made her choice. Now I was making mine. The last thing I heard as I walked down the hallway, my steps ringing in the emptiness, was Steve's sneering voice. "Better a divorce than such a worthless husband." My jaw tightened, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. He wasn't worth it. Neither of them were. The sound of the party downstairs swelled as I neared the stairs, laughter and music filling the air like nothing had happened. But for me, the night, and my life as I knew it, was over. I needed time to breathe, time to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. But staying under the same roof as Charlotte was unbearable. Every second in that house felt like a fresh stab in the gut, a reminder of her betrayal. I packed my things that very night, cramming clothes and essentials into a duffel bag, and called my cousin Daniel. He didn't even hesitate when I asked if I could stay with him for a couple of months. "Come over," he said, no questions asked. By the time the holidays were over, I knew what I had to do. As I promised, I found a lawyer, a no-nonsense type recommended by a friend, and filed for divorce. Every meeting, every signature, every step of the process felt like pulling a splinter from a wound, painful but necessary. Charlotte, of course, tried everything to stop me. She called, texted, even showed up unannounced at Daniel's place once, begging me to hear her out. "It was a mistake," she said over and over, her voice raw with desperation. "We can fix this. We can go back to the way things were." I told her the truth. There was no going back. "Do you even understand what you did?" I asked her one day when she cornered me on the front porch. "You didn't just cheat on me, Charlotte. You dragged me to that party, paraded me around like a fool, and then went upstairs to sleep with your boss while I was still there. How do you think anyone comes back from that?" She tried to apologize, tears streaming down her face, but I wasn't interested. Her words were empty, just like her promises of a future together. The only thing I wanted from her was a quick, clean divorce. I didn't even care about taking more than my fair share. I just wanted out. To her credit, Charlotte didn't fight me on the terms. Maybe her guilt weighed too heavily on her. Or maybe she just wanted it over as much as I did. We divided everything evenly, settled things quickly in court, and moved on with our separate lives. I didn't even need to use the video I'd recorded of her and Steve. Just the memory of it was enough to keep me from ever wanting to see her again. But then came the part that almost made me laugh. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, I got an envelope in the mail. Inside was a bill from Steve, for the door I'd broken that night in his office. The gall of that man. It was like he was daring me to retaliate. I paid the bill, but not because I thought he deserved it. No, I had a better idea. If Steve thought he'd won, he had no idea what was coming. I didn't know if Charlotte and Steve were still together, and frankly I didn't care. But I did know one thing. Charlotte still worked for him. That gave me an opening, a chance to shake things up in his world. Steve was the company's golden boy, their most valuable director, and I knew taking him down wouldn't be easy. But I wasn't about to back down. If there was one thing I'd learned, it was that even the most untouchable people had weak spots. I started gathering information, piecing together every shred of insight I could find about Steve and the company he worked for. It turned out that the business was privately held, with shares divided among 6 major shareholders. Steve didn't own the company. He worked for these people. They were the real power behind the scenes. I dug deeper, using social media and corporate filings to track down 2 of them. I crafted a careful letter, 1 part accusation and 1 part plea, detailing how their hired director, Steve, violated not just corporate standards, but also basic moral and ethical principles. I made it clear that this wasn't just about me, that Steve's behavior reflected poorly on the entire organization. I didn't expect much. People in power rarely want to rock the boat, and I was prepared to escalate to Plan B, leaking everything to the media and turning the company's dirty laundry into a public scandal. But to my surprise, I received a reply from one of the shareholders, Lawrence Whitaker, an elderly gentleman with a reputation as a shrewd businessman and a staunch conservative. Mr. Whitaker invited me to meet him at his office, and I didn't hesitate. The day of the meeting, I arrived early, sitting in the waiting room with my nerves taut like a bowstring. When I was finally ushered in, I found myself face to face with a man who radiated quiet authority. He was in his late 70s, impeccably dressed, with a piercing gaze that made me feel like he could see straight through me. "Mr. Whitaker," I began, "thank you for seeing me." He nodded, gesturing for me to take a seat. "Your letter caught my attention, Mr. Landon. I don't make it a habit to intervene in day-to-day business matters, but your claims are serious. If true, they concern me deeply. I'd like to hear the full story." I told him everything, from the party where Charlotte dragged me, to catching her and Steve in his office, to how Steve tried to gaslight me and shift the blame. I kept my tone steady, but as I recounted the events, I couldn't help the edge of anger that crept into my voice. When I finished, I opened my phone and played the video I'd recorded that night. Mr. Whitaker watched in silence, his expression growing darker with each passing second. When the video ended, he leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him. For a long moment he said nothing, and the quiet stretched until it felt unbearable. "Mr. Landon," he said finally, his voice calm but firm, "what you've shown me is disgraceful. Not only is Mr. Pierce's behavior morally reprehensible, but it also brings shame to the organization he represents. This company is built on trust and respect, values that Mr. Pierce has flagrantly disregarded." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm not asking for anything for myself, Mr. Whitaker. I just want justice. People like Steve shouldn't get away with treating others like stepping stones." He studied me for a moment longer, then gave a single decisive nod. "You'll have it. I can't promise this will be quick or easy, but I assure you, Mr. Pierce's actions will not go unanswered." Not much time passed before the company began conducting internal investigations. Lawrence Whitaker was a man of his word. Through whispers and hints from people, I learned that Steve had been subjected to a brutal dressing down by the board. His charm and bravado couldn't save him this time. They fined him a significant amount for violations of corporate conduct, then fired him in a manner that left his reputation in tatters. Word spread quickly in their industry, and Steve's name became synonymous with scandal. Charlotte didn't escape unscathed either. She resigned shortly after Steve's dismissal. Maybe it was to save face, or maybe she couldn't bear to stay in the aftermath of the mess she'd helped create. Either way, she was gone. A few weeks later, I received a call from Mr. Whitaker's office inviting me to another meeting. When I arrived, he greeted me warmly, his demeanor more relaxed than before. "Mr. Landon," he said, gesturing for me to sit, "justice has been served. I thought you deserved to know." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. There was a finality in his tone, a sense that the chapter had been closed. "Steve Pierce has been dealt with," he continued. "His misconduct has cost him dearly, not just financially, but professionally. And as for Charlotte," he hesitated briefly, his expression softening. "She too has faced the consequences of her actions." I wasn't sure what to say, but then he handed me an envelope. "This is for you," he said simply. "Consider it compensation for the suffering you endured. And don't worry, it didn't come out of the company's pocket. We made sure Mr. Pierce paid for it." I opened the envelope to find a substantial amount of money inside. It wasn't enough to erase the pain, but it was enough to help me start over with a stronger foundation. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker," I said quietly. He nodded. "You've been through a great deal, Mr. Landon. I hope this helps you move forward. And for what it's worth, you have my sympathy. Betrayal is a wound that takes time to heal." I left his office feeling lighter, as though the weight of Steve and Charlotte's betrayal had finally been lifted from my shoulders. The money wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. 6 months later, fate played a strange hand. I was walking through a park when I saw Charlotte. She was alone, sitting on a bench, her face turned toward the sky as if searching for something unseen. She noticed me before I could turn away, and for a moment, our eyes met. I hesitated, but she stood and walked toward me. "Matthew," she said softly, stopping a few steps away. She reached out and gently took my hand, her touch tentative, Forgive me. I did stupid things, and I thought I controlled the whole world. I thought I was invincible. But you showed me the truth, showed me who I really am." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. Then, with a sad smile, she said goodbye and walked away. I didn't try to stop her, and she didn't look back. As I watched her go, I realized something. The divorce hadn't just changed me, it had changed her too. It seemed she had come to understand the gravity of her actions, even if it was too late to undo the damage. As for Steve, I heard through the grapevine that his career had taken a nosedive after his dramatic exit. Unable to find a position that matched his former status, he ended up working as an ordinary manager at a struggling company just to stay afloat. It seemed that Mr. Whitaker had done everything in his power to ensure Steve's name remained radioactive in the industry. For a petty womanizer like Steve, it was a fitting downfall. He'd played his games and lost, and now he was living with the consequences. I couldn't think of a more fitting end to his story, or a better reminder that justice, in the end, has its own way of balancing the scales. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. I wish you a great mood and good luck.